Hey, poker people, it's Sky Matsuhashi, and this is a Smart Poker Study Podcast. Episode 139 last week was a great interview with Dr. Tricia Hardner. We talked about her poker playing history, and there's actually quite a bit of it. We talked about her course on procrastination and her plans for this year's WSOP. Hey, poker people, thanks again for tuning in and for giving me a little bit of your study time today. Maybe you're not studying, actually. Maybe you're doing the laundry or walking the dog or driving your car to work, whatever, coming back home. But whatever you're doing, you've given me a bit of your time, and I'm super appreciative for it. Thank you very much. So let's just dive in. Some poker time now. Actually, and it's, to be a little bit more specific, it's poker math. And the math we're talking about is implied odds. We're going to talk about pre and post flop implied odds to help us in our decision making. And, I've mentioned it prior times in the podcast, but I've never really dove into implied odds. So that's what we're doing today. Please visit the show notes page for everything I discuss, along with screenshots and links at www.smartpokerstudy.com/pod140. And while you're there, please sign up for the weekly boost for exclusive poker strategy direct to that inbox. Alrighty, it's time. Gambate!
And now for our feature presentation.
Alrighty, so let's talk about implied odds. I'm sure you've all heard about it, but implied odds is the amount of money, or the chips if you're playing in a poker tournament, the amount of money that you can expect to win if you hit your speculative hand. So let's say your head's up and the effective stacks are like $30. You could potentially win $30 more. And implied odds actually helps us make more positive EV decisions. With implied odds, we can make calls that are technically negative EV right now. But if we hit our hand, we can stand to win a lot of money down the streets. And that kind of makes our hand positive EV over the course of the hand. Let's look at a quick example here, kind of a pre-flop set mining example. Let's say we are dealt pocket fours in the big blind. There is a loose aggressive player. He opens up in the MP, and we put him on like a 20% range, which is, lots of pocket pairs and broadways and some suited connectors, suited aces kind of stuff. And Flopzilla says that our pocket fours have about a 45% equity versus that 20% range. So that's an easy call, right? Well, not really. If we think to the future, we're calling with pocket fours. We're going to be out of position. We're not happy without flopping a set on any other board other than like deuce 3-5 board. We're really not so happy when we don't flop the set because our opponent is a lag player and they're opening with kind of a tighter, 20% range in the MP. We're going to be facing probably lots of post-flop aggression. And we're not guaranteed to see the river because of all these things. Out of position, not happy without a set. We only have pocket fours, and we're going to face a lot of aggression, means we're going to be folding a lot. This is not a bread and butter situation. But if we take implied odds into account, we could possibly turn this into a good situation. When you think about implied odds, you want to use the 20x rule. And what I'm talking about right now is the pre-flop game, The 20x rule states that there should be 20 times the bet remaining in the effective stacks to make it worthwhile to play speculative hands. So let's say right now, pocket fours in the big blind, we're facing a $1 bet. You want at least $20 in the stacks behind to make playing your speculative hand potentially profitable. And following the 20x rule helps to mitigate the fact that with a lot of speculative hands, we sometimes miss our hand and have to fold on the flop. Sometimes we catch a draw and we choose to stay in longer to make the hand, and it costs us more money when we miss or we fold. Sometimes we hit the hand and they still beat us with a better hand. Sometimes we hit the hand and get little value because they fold on a scary flop. Or the last instance is we hit the hand and get paid off. That's the best instance out of all of these. But we need that 20x rule to help us to make the most money profitable with these speculative hands. And I keep talking about speculative hands. Let's get to those real quick. Speculative hands, they hope to hit something on the flop, and they can't stand a lot of post-flop pressure without some good flopping strength, For example, small to medium pocket pairs like deuces through nines, you want to hit a set or maybe a very good straight draw. And sets only hit 1 in 9 times, and straight draws only flop 1 in 22 times, give or take. So those are small to medium pocket pairs as speculative hands. Suited connectors are also speculative hands. We play those for flush and straight and big drawing power or 2 pair pair is often really good with those suited connectors. The odds of flopping a flush are less than 1%. The odds of flopping a straight are a little bit over 1% of the time. The odds of flopping a flush draw or a straight draw are 32% of the time. So as you can see, you're going to flop draws way more often with these suited connectors than you will flop made hands. And because you'll flop the draws so often, you're actually going to be forking over more money to try to catch your draws. That's one of the dangers of suited connectors. You rarely hit, or I should say you rarely hit super strong, but you hit draws quite often, costing you a little bit more money. And suited aces are the last type of speculative hand I'll be talking about. And those are ace deuce suited through ace nine suited. And that gives you some flushy options here. Like I said, the odds of flopping a flush are less than 1%. And the odds of flopping a straight with the ace deuce 3-4 or the ace 5 is actually only 0.16%, almost zero. I mean, it hardly ever happens. And the odds of flopping a flush draw or a straight draw with these suited aces are about 19% of the time, or 1 in every 5 instances. So with the suited aces, you're going to be flopping a ton of flush draws, which could cost you some more money. Granted, though, you do have the ace for some good top pair power. You could be outkicked, but if you're up against pocket kings, queens, or jacks, hitting that ace could make or break your hand right here. So when you're choosing to play some of these speculative hands, the suited connectors, the small to medium pocket pairs, the suited aces, the 20x rule is not the end-all be-all. You can't just say, well, there's 20x behind and I've got 8-7 suited. I've got to call. No. There's way more to consider than just that. First off, you want to consider the likelihood of getting paid off. Does my opponent have a hard time folding? If I hit my flush or my straight, will that card scare them into folding even top pair hands? Because you could imagine somebody with pocket queens, all of a sudden the river comes 3 to the straight or 3 to the flush. They could fold if you choose to make a big bet, even with top pair or an over pair. It's something to consider for sure. You also want to just think about your hand in general before you play that post flop. Like, how does a pocket pair, a suited connector, or a suited ace, how does it make money in general post flop? And what kind of flops are you looking for when you play those? You want to have a good idea before you click that call button pre-flop. And of course, think about your position. Are you out of position or in position on the flop? And then, of course, depending on your position, what plays can you take advantage of for bluffing? What plays can you take advantage of if you actually hit something really good and try to go for value? There's a few more considerations. You also want to think about, of course, with any hand, you want to think about your opponent. What type of player are you up against? The guy who raised, you're deciding to call. Well, you're choosing right now to see this flop against this player with this hand. You need to understand your opponent. Is he loose? Is he aggressive? Is he bluffy? Is he only value betting? Is he flop on his turn honest? I mean, what do you know about him? And you want to think about how your relative position will affect their play. A lot of opponents, they fold a whole lot on the flop or turn when they're out of position, and they never fold when they're in position. That kind of thing. So understand how they play by position. And then, of course, you want to think about your potential opponent. So if you're calling in the instance we just talked about, pocket force on the button, great, you're ending the action, and your call allows you to see the flop right then and there. But let's say your opponent opened the MP, and you're in the cutoff. Well, if you call, you have the button, the small blind, and the big blind to worry about. If you're nine-handed, and your opponent opened under the gun, and you call under the gun +1, great, you got to worry about under the gun +2, MP1, MP2, cutoff, button, small blind, big blind, so many players. So pay attention to your potential opponents and think about, hey, if I call now, how are the rest of these players going to respond? Am I going to face 5 more callers? 1 caller? Am I going to face a squeeze? What is going to happen? That's the question you want to ask. And of course, also think about your image. Are you a bluffy and aggressive player? What types of hands has your opponent seen you show down when you're calling pre-flop? Do you call with a ton of suited connectors and that's all you call with? Well then, if that's the case, he could put you on those types of hands post. If your calling range varies between every single type of card, it's much harder for them to put you on a range. And of course, if you're bluffy and you suddenly start betting on that third flush card or the third straight card, they might not put you on that, and they will more likely call and give you value when you hit that speculative hand. But what if you're simply a super nitty, tight aggressive player? All of a sudden on the turn, the 3 flush hits, and you come out firing. He's going to put you on it, and he can really likely fold over pairs and top pairs, definitely second and third pairs by that point. And one other consideration you have to take into account is the future board textures. Before you click that call button, have an idea of what types of boards hit or miss your range, and have an idea of what types of boards hit or miss your opponent's range. And then you want to ask yourself, hey, if I hit my hand here, can I get value out of my miracle hand versus this opponent on this board? All right, so that is pre-flop implied odds. Take the 20x rule into account. Think about your hand, how well it plays, think about your opponent, and all those other considerations before you hit that call button. And remember, of course, you could have 3-bet pre. When somebody opens and you have a speculative hand, your only choice is not to call. You can fold, you can call, and you can 3-bet. Potentially, that 3-bet could be a good play. You've got to think about it. And you can go back and listen to those 3-bet episodes within the MED series, and those are episodes 104, 105, 107, and 108. Alrighty, so let's talk about some post-flop implied odds here. We can still use the idea of implied odds for our post-flop decisions. But we'll run through post-flop implied odds with a good example here. So a tight aggressive player in early position, he opens to $3. We call in the big blind with ace of spades, 6 of spades. So it's a decent suited ace, which can crack some big hands. If our opponent opened pocket jacks, queens, and kings, we hit that ace, we've got the goods. If we hit a flush with his overpair, we've got the goods and can get some value, After we call in the big blind, the effective stacks are $50. So there's $50 behind in this instance with a $7 flop. On the flop, the board comes down jack of spades, 3 of spades, 2 of clubs. So of course, with the 2 spades on the board, we have the nut flush draw for an 18% chance of hitting it on the turn. If we use that ×2 rule for our 9 outs, 9 times 2, 18% equity here. We decide to check because we don't want to show aggression just yet, because we haven't made a hand and we don't think our opponent's going to fold at all, So we check, and the tight aggressive early position player, he bets $5 into the $7 pot. And maybe we suspect, because he's tight aggressive in the early position, we suspect an overpair like queens or better on this jack high board. Maybe even pocket jacks for top set, Of course, we could make the semi-bluff check raise here, but there's also the option of calling with our draw. The break-even math on the call is the $5 call to win the total pot of $17. And the $17 is the $7 pot plus his $5 bet plus our $5 call. So 5 divided by 17 means we've got a break-even point of 29%. We need 29% equity to make a mathematically correct call. But, like we said earlier, 9 outs means we only have 18% equity. So we've got to fold or raise, right? Well, not exactly. If we think our opponent is married to his hand and will pay us off even on a 3-flush board, then we can include his remaining $50 within the amount that we can win. So our new break-even formula is now the $5 call divided by a potential pot of $67. It was 17 before. We might win his additional 50. That's 67 now. This means we only need 5 divided by $67, or only 7% equity, and we definitely have that with our nut flush draw. So we decide to make the call. Now, this is an example, and this is the kind of math you could do at any time post-flop. But something very important, if there's one thing you listen to in this episode, this is it right here. We have to be careful to not let the idea of implied odds let us call too often. We've got the nut flush draw here. Great. If we only had an 8 high flush draw, then we may not want to call. When you're using implied odds post-flop to call on a draw, there's 4 things I want you to remember. Number 1, be reasonably sure your opponent can pay you off. In this instance, we think he has an overpair or even top set. He's not going to be folding those not so quickly to a bet when the 3rd flush card comes. The second thing you've got to remember is you want to be drawing to the nuts. We've got the nut flush draw. If we had an 8 high flush draw, I'd be less inclined to call here using implied odds. I would call using just straight mathematical pot odds math, just straight break-even math. But if you're going to take implied odds into account, draw to the nuts, baby. The third thing I want you to consider is you want to have an open-ended straight draw or better. Open-ended straight draw is 8 outs. If you had the open-ender plus the flush draw, that's even more outs. That's beautiful. 15 outs. If you had the open-ender plus a flush draw plus a pair. So you also have like 2 pair or trip outs. That's a whole lot more. So you want to have those 8 outs or more. And all of this, it all leads to consideration number 4 here. You want to err on the side of caution. You're essentially giving your opponent value right now by calling with your draw. So you need to be sure it's worth it for a big payday later in the hand. If the payday is unlikely, don't give him value and just fold that draw. Challenge! Here's my challenge to you for this episode. In your next study session, do a hand history review on 5 flopped flush draw spots and 5 flopped straight draw spots. And I know you know how to filter these in your Poker Tracker 4 or Hold'em Manager database, so I'm not going to explain that here. Review these hands and look for mistakes in your drawing logic. Did you fold when you should have called? Did you call when it was obvious you should have folded? Reviewing these spots will make you a better draw hunter and implied odds gatherer. Now it's your turn to take action and do something positive for your poker game.
Now get it on.
This episode isn't complete until you head to the show notes page at www.smartpokerstudy.com/pod140. When you go there, you can find screenshots and links to everything discussed today, and you can find some ways in which you can support the podcast to keep me keeping on. And I've got a few shout-outs to some awesome poker people who've purchased some of my most recent webinars. Oliver purchased How to Study Poker webinar and the Opponent Destruction webinar. And for my upcoming webinar, Poker Mathematics, we've got Daniel Spencer, Garrett Romaine, Charles Ogle, W. Hughes, Jay Bookbinder, Peter Levy, Trent Gray, Adam Broskow, Lawrence Adams, Stephen Bell, Philippe Verhelst, DDS, Bob Brown, Johan Cederland, NHL Star, Saki Mojo, Michael Bin, Tim Zajac, Todd Crosswell, and Nadal Martorell. Thank you all so much for buying the upcoming webinar, Poker Mathematics, that I'm going to be hosting quite soon with Mark Warner from ExceptionalPoker.com. Thank you all very much, and we are working hard to make this a killer webinar. I guarantee you'll get a ton out of it. And I've got a quick review. I don't have a name, but this review for my new book came from an Amazon customer, and it's a verified purchase, which means this person bought the book and left a comment. I love it. The title is quite useful, 5 stars. Reminded me how much I forgot how to study. I have numerous poker books, but I haven't retained much from reading them other than the books themselves. Using this book as I go through some other books, things are really making sense and easier to remember what it is I was trying to learn to begin with. All right, well, thank you very much, Amazon customer. You rock super hard. I totally appreciate it. If you want to support the show, like any of these gnarly poker peeps who are buying webinars and leaving reviews and buying my book, I love you for it. Visit the show notes for every way that you can support. All right, thanks for listening, everybody, to today's podcast. If you can type in the words Smart Poker Study, you can find me on Twitter, Facebook, Twitch, YouTube, Amazon. You can also send me an email to sky@smartpokerstudy.com. And, of course, next week in episode 141, we'll do class number 3 on poker math. Stay tuned for that one. Word of mouth is the best advertising, so thank you very much for sharing the show with other poker people. Your sharing and caring is helping us grow. Until next time, study smart, play much, and make your next session the best one yet.